Hi, everybody. Welcome. Um, I'm Clark Barrett. Hi to everyone at home, to everyone here. Welcome to another talk in the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. Today's talk is going to be, our speaker is on Zoom, visiting us from Penn State University. And my understanding is that the remainder of the talks this quarter, or most of them, will be in person, right? So we meet in Haynes Hall 352. Those of you who are here around UCLA, please feel free to come and visit in person, although I think there's always going to be a Zoom option, right? So, yeah. But our visitors will be in person for the rest of the quarter. So with that said, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Asher Rosinger from Penn State University. Asher is going to be talking to us today about water needs, water insecurity, and nutritional adaptations, the intersecting pathways to human biology. So welcome, Asher. We can see your slides. Go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks. So thanks for that long introduction, Clark. So, privileged to be here. But in seriousness,
glad you're here virtually.
Yeah, to be here virtually. I'm here in sunny State College, whereas you all are in very cloudy Southern California. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss 3 streams of my research: human water needs, how water insecurity becomes embodied in health, and then how humans cope with these environmental stressors through their diets and behaviors, and the human biology implications. And then I'll wrap up with some of the broader themes that this helps inform. I understand that you all, at least in person, have lunch, and hopefully you have something to drink, because every time I talk about water, people seem to get really thirsty. And also, I'm still waiting for the drone to deliver my Grubhub here as what I get for giving this talk.
Window is, it'll be there between 24 and 48 hours.
Okay.
Yeah, should still be warm.
All right, so first a little background about me and the way that I conceptualize these questions. After my graduate work at the University of Georgia, I did a 2-year fellowship with the Centers for Disease Control as an Epidemic Intelligence Service officer, where I was deployed to Puerto Rico to work on the Zika virus outbreak. And this experience of working on a virus which has tremendous intergenerational health consequences opened my eyes to the importance of thinking about developmental effects and how far-reaching water problems can be, even in places that we think of as water secure, like a US territory. At Penn State, I direct the Water, Health, and Nutrition Lab. I've been here since 2017, and my lab aims to understand cross-cultural variation and how humans meet their water needs, and where I integrate and train students and postdocs. On a global level, there's still 2 billion people who don't have access to safely managed drinking water due to socioeconomic inequalities, infrastructural aging, and higher frequency and intensity of dangerous climatic events. Water insecurity can manifest in a few different ways: water scarcity, or living in places without enough water, or the inverse, living in places with too much dirty water or that may flood, as well as dealing with water contamination issues. So water problems aren't isolated to low-income countries. There have been a number of recent water infrastructure crises in the United States, with Flint, Michigan, most prominently, and again in Jackson, Mississippi, just this year. And throughout this talk, I'm gonna move across these forms of water insecurity because I work in all 3 locations. And it's important to note that water problems are only expected to get worse with climate change and extreme climatic events. They have critical implications for water needs and water security and many facets of human biology. And in fact, we have a special issue out this month that I want to give a little plug to in American Journal of Human Biology, where we try to help catalyze biological anthropologists to contribute to this domain. And it also has a contribution by your own Brooke Skelza. Okay. Water is the most basic physiological need, which links biology, culture, and the environment. 2 main questions drive my research. First, How do water needs and experiences around water affect human health through trade-offs in nutrition, stress, and disease risk? And in turn, how do interactions with physical and nutritional environments shape human adaptability and variation in water needs? In essence, what are the strategies used to meet water needs and buffer risk? My research is at the intersection of evolutionary, environmental, and biocultural questions. I integrate data and methods from these fields because inherently these relationships are nested within one another. So to build a human biology of water framework, it's necessary to examine the selection pressures that drive water needs, like ecological variation, as well as how humans adapt to and interact with their physical environments, weather, and climate. Yet these factors also affect the current cultural and socioeconomic conditions in populations, such as behaviors and traditions, perception of water safety, and access to beverages, which affect the immediate water availability in the diet, exposure to pathogens, and nutritional status, which may have implications for developmental and life course pathways affecting water needs and health. Next, I want to talk a little bit about my field sites, orient you to those and the methods. Since 2009, I've worked in lowland Bolivia among Chamane, a group of about 16,000 forager horticulturalists who lack access to clean water and are highly reliant on the Maniqui River, which is the most important water source for many households as it's used to bathe, get water, wash clothes and dishes, to play, to fish, to cool off, and to travel. However, it's also a source of pathogen exposure, as the majority of Chamane have parasites and many suffer from water-related infections. My work here began with the Chamane Amazonian Panel Study, which is a longitudinal study that has used distance to the main market town of San Borja as a natural experiment to understand how market integration affects lifestyle changes and health, and importantly for me, factors like access to clean water, market foods, beverages, and goods, since the majority of villages are built along the Maniqui River and most travel is by canoe. And I use this design in my follow-up studies here as well. Since 2017, I've worked in northern Kenya with Dasanich semi-nomadic pastoralists who live in the hot, arid region along the lower Omo River Valley and Turkana Basin. They number around 26,000, and they're highly marginalized as they receive few resources from the Kenyan government. In fact, this picture shown here is their only healthcare center in the main town of Ilaret. And so they face a variety of environmental and socioeconomic challenges, leaving individual communities at high risk for malnutrition and disease. Along with my collaborator, Herman Poncer at Duke University, we implemented a longitudinal study similar to the Bolivian design with 7 communities at varying distances to the main market town of Ilaret for 2 reasons. First, to be able to examine effects of lifestyle transitions from a more mobile, pastoralist lifestyle to a more sedentary one, but also because this leads to variation in access to types of water and water quality. Among both populations, I collect equivalent measures of water and food insecurity, assess diet, perceived stress scales. We assess anthropometrics as we measure people's height, weight, percent body fat. We measure blood pressure. We collect urine samples to measure urine-specific gravity, which compares the density of urine to the density of water as a way to assess hydration status, as well as by analyzing these urine samples for energy expenditure and water turnover, which my collaborator does. And then we also collect blood spots and point of care biomarkers. And finally, we've collected hair samples with Chamane and fingernail samples with the Dasanich as a way to assess cortisol concentration and a chronic stress biomarker. I also incorporate environmental measures, including weather data used to assess heat stress and water quality analysis to measure chemical and physical characteristics of water, including salinity of water, which I'll talk a lot about today, and the specific ionic composition, as well as bacteriological analyses. In my work, I think it's important to highlight that I discuss priorities of the research with communities ahead of time and try to return these results to the communities as quickly as possible, which is why we use many point-of-care biomarkers that we can explain the significance of the results to in real time to the participants, and then we're able to consult with the local health clinic in order for people to get treatment as they need. We also give back the results of the in-field water quality analysis in real time as a way to empower them and provide recommendations about different water source use and treatment techniques. Finally, I use data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES, which conducts interviews and physical exams to monitor the health and nutritional status of the civilian non-institutionalized household population in the US. NHANES uses a complex multi-stage probability sampling design to create a representative sample. So participants come to the mobile exam center after a household interview where they complete physical examinations and dietary interviews. They have this awesome set of trailers that they drive across 30 different sites across, in the United States every 2 years to create this nationally representative sample. And, you know, this is showing it in San Francisco. So pretty close to you all, at least closer than to me. And I've been inside these trailers. I've done a tour and it's so high tech. I mean, every single module that they have is state of the art. They even have a DEXA scanner in there where participants will lay down and they do a full body analysis for body fat measures. If you want to read more about ways to implement methods for measuring human water needs, as well as about how to analyze secondary data sets, there are a couple of toolkit articles that are useful, and I'm just highlighting them here on the slide right now in case you want to reference them. Okay, so now that I've introduced you to the problem, the field sites, and the methods, I want to discuss three different questions. First, how human water needs are shaped, including how heat and water restriction in early life affect water needs. Water needs are fascinating because they're influenced by more than just our daily activities, but also our evolutionary past and the way our bodies respond to the environment through thirst. Throughout human evolution, water needs have played an important selective pressure affecting survival. One example is that changes in body size and proportion had important implications for water needs through thermoregulation. Between 4 and 1.5 million years ago, changes in body form between Australopithecus and Homo erectus significantly affected water needs by changing exposure to wind and solar radiation, which reduced sweat rates and water needs by 15 to 20%. And these changes in water efficiency may have allowed for longer periods of foraging. Another key example of morphological adaptations related to water needs among humans is the external nose, the schnoz. Especially in dry environments, this provides the ability to retrieve moisture from exhaled air and then use this moisture to humidify the next breath to help conserve and reduce body water loss. Next, sweat glands, primarily eccrine glands, allow for loss of body water in response to thermoregulation to keep body temperature stable. Humans have more eccrine sweat glands than any other primate. And a recent study found that repeated mutations of a gene called INGRELD1 may have led to this abundance of eccrine sweat glands. Now, overall, these adaptations demonstrate how important responses to water availability in the environment were throughout human evolution. The kidneys play a key role in body water and electrolyte balance. The number of nephrons, or the functional units of the kidney, correspond to capacity. They remove filtrates from blood before it becomes toxic, and these nephrons are critical to concentrating urine to conserve body water. Now, mammals are unique in that they only have kidneys to osmoregulate. And there's an inverse scaling relationship between body mass and maximal urine concentrating ability in the kidney. However, this also depends on habitat and diet. For example, the desert pocket mouse, which lives in the arid southwestern US, weighs only 17 grams and can produce highly concentrated urine. Sanborn's long-nosed bat, which weighs about the same as the mouse, and despite living in an arid environment, can only produce very dilute urine due to its diet that relies exclusively on watery fruit. Camels, on the other hand, live in arid environments, weigh 500 kilos, and can produce very concentrated urine. Now, humans fall toward the bottom of the spectrum of ability to concentrate urine, meaning that we're more dependent on exogenous water sources than many other mammals and can become easily dehydrated. To understand the human biology of water needs, we must examine the physiology and functionality of hydration. Hydration status is the internal state of water balance within an organism. And this falls along a continuum, but it's also constantly in flux. Overhydration occurs when more water is consumed than is required. A normally hydrated state occurs when you consume the same amount as you expend. And finally, dehydration occurs when your water intake falls short of water outputs. It's important to note that concentrated urine in the short term is a good thing. This is the body's response to water scarcity. You go for a run and you sweat out a lot of water. Well, your kidneys are going to concentrate the remaining urine that you have so that to prevent water loss. It's a way of conserving water, but it's the chronic dehydration that's bad. Hydration is critical to physiological and cognitive health. Chronic dehydration can cause cellular stress, decreases in kidney function, and higher risk of kidney stones. Mild dehydration adversely affects aerobic exercise tasks by reducing the body's ability to modulate core temperatures. It also affects cognitive performance, like decreases in short-term memory, while increasing perceived fatigue and irritability. Severe dehydration is associated with the blood becoming viscous, breakdown of motor skills, and ultimately death. Humans and non-human primates can only lose up to about 10% of their body weight in water before risk of death. So go ahead and take a sip of water. Since water balance is so important, there are many systems in place to return the body to a normally hydrated state. As the body and brain detect water deficits and excesses, thereby releasing or restricting the antidiuretic hormone vasopressin and conserving body water or excreting it, with the signals getting stronger depending on the level of imbalance. The distribution of total water intake for US women and men, shown here on this graph, illustrates that even in a relatively water-secure environment, the amount of total water consumed from foods and beverages in the diet is widely variable to meet people's water needs, ranging from around 1 to 6 liters in total. Importantly, hydration biomarkers map onto population curves of water intake. Here's a hypothetical population curve describing water intake, with the majority of people meeting their water needs. Some are chronically overhydrated, the high intake group, and some are chronically underhydrated, the low intake group. And an important point is that while water intake does change somewhat from day to day, where you can consume a lot of water one day and less the next, the average intake stays pretty consistent without external factors. Several studies have examined variation in hydration biomarkers in high and low intake groups, and they find that urine osmolality, urine specific gravity, vasopressin, and cortisol are all higher among the low intake group compared to the high intake group. Now, intervention studies have experimentally manipulated how much people in the high and low intake groups drink, assigning each group to consume what the other was consuming. And when this is done, Biomarkers of hydration, including vasopressin, shown here on the y-axis, which is the hormone most responsible for water conservation, reverse. However, when you go back to normal ad libitum drinking, the effects reverse again. And this indicates that where a person is in terms of their daily water intake habits manifest in biomarkers of hydration. Essentially, the body adapts to the level of water that you regularly consume. But what decides where a person is on this curve to begin with? What happens when there's a drought or severe water shortage, thereby affecting women who are pregnant? And what might that do to their offspring? Is there evidence that where a person ends up on this curve is influenced by development? And are there consequences to intake patterns? Experimental evidence from studies on lambs and rats has shown that maternal water restriction during pregnancy affects offspring body water homeostasis. The researchers simulated dehydration in the offspring by intravenous infusion of a hypertonic saline to see how they responded to it. Prenatally dehydrated offspring, the triangle symbols here on the top lines in the both panels, maintained persistently elevated plasma osmolality in this first panel, which measures the body's electrolyte water balance, and plasma sodium, shown in the second panel, compared to controlled twins and controlled singletons. The prenatally dehydrated offspring also demonstrated an increased plasma osmolality threshold for vasopressin secretion. That is, the intercept shifted to the right, and there was an increased slope of the plasma osmolality regression lines compared to the control singletons and twins. So what this indicates is that among the prenatally dehydrated, their thirst and brain set points detecting bodily dehydration don't kick in until they're relatively more dehydrated. But when they do, it's more sensitive. In essence, allowing the body to conserve water until later, but then really shifting into gear when they need to. One way to understand how our bodies respond to changing water needs in the short term is by looking at how we respond to heat. Let's compare two distinct thermal environments: the hot, arid desert of northern Kenya, where the average heat index was 34 degrees Celsius, and the hot, humid Bolivian Amazon, where the average heat index was 32 degrees Celsius. To orient you, here's urine-specific gravity, a biomarker of hydration status on the y-axis, with a dehydration cutoff point of 1.020, shown as the dotted line, and increasing USG means a more dehydrated state, with temperature on the x-axis. We found that heat index was the strongest predictor of hydration status in these hot environments without access to climate control. However, Chimani living in the hot, humid environment had significantly higher USG than Dasanich, indicating that it's harder to maintain good hydration in a hot, humid environment than a hot, arid environment. This demonstrates a key dilemma in the human physiological response to heat, namely the reduced effectiveness of sweat evaporation to cool the body in humidity. So hydration status is influenced by temperature, but do early life experiences affect the way thirst is perceived? Thirst is the mechanism that drives the behavioral response to drink and maintain body water homeostasis. To test this concept, we interviewed 607 Chimani and Dasanich adults in the hot, humid, and hot, arid environment and asked them to rate their thirst. We showed them, sorry, I don't have that, but I'll get back to this. Okay, so we showed them a scale and asked them to indicate how pleasant it would be to drink some water right now, along with asking about their season of birth and measuring their ambient temperature, humidity, and hydration. We then calculated water availability by trimester of when they were born And here I'm showing that in northern Kenya, being born in the wet season was roughly equivalent with being in utero with 19% less rainwater, with the difference coming from the second trimester. Being exposed to less water availability, which may signal to the offspring that they're entering an environment with less water. We found that ambient temperature, shown on the x-axis, was strongly associated to perceived thirst on the y-axis. And this was much more acutely shown in the hot, dry environment in this light shade of blue, compared to the Chimani, which showed a slight increase and then kind of a plateauing of perceived thirst. But there was a significant interaction between birth seasons and temperature on the pleasantness of drinking water, which was driven by the Kenyan data. Dasanich, born in the wet season, that is, they were in utero during less water availability, had a blunted pleasantness of drinking water at higher temperatures. That is, with higher temperatures, a situation of greater water needs, their desire to drink water goes up, but not as strongly as those born during the dry season. The key takeaways are that exposures in utero and early life, like water restriction and availability, may affect thirst sensitivity to heat and water feedback mechanisms, and tell the body that it needs to drink water to correct the deficit. These factors may affect where people start out on this curve in prime water needs, particularly in arid environments. Next, I want to discuss how aspects of water get under the skin and become embodied in later life health. Now, you're probably thinking, water insecurity? I didn't realize water could be insecure. Well, it can. Always wondering what people are going to think of it, who's going to study it. But in seriousness, water insecurity is defined as the inability to access and benefit from sufficient, reliable, and acceptable water for well-being and a healthy life. There are 4 key dimensions of water insecurity. Availability. Is there water present? Access. Can one get to it without various barriers? Use. Is it possible and acceptable for one to drink, bathe, and irrigate with this water? And reliability. Does availability and access and use vary over time? And when any of these domains are present, water insecurity occurs. The majority of research has assessed how water insecurity is associated with psychosocial stress and mental well-being, discussed as suffering for water and suffering from water, but less has examined physical and chronic health outcomes. One of the things I've really been trying to understand is looking at the various human biology implications of living with water insecurity at various stages throughout the life course, and how these problems often compound over time. During infancy and childhood, there's evidence it can affect risk of dehydration, altered gut microbiome, and cognitive performance. During pregnancy and lactation, water restriction may lead to higher stress and affect fetal homeostatic thirst set points, as well as lead to smaller fetal body size, which may point to intergenerational effects of water insecurity. And in adulthood, proxies of water insecurity are associated with kidney function, blood pressure, and food insecurity, which are some of the leading causes of morbidity and mortality worldwide, and I'm going to focus on right now. The concept of embodiment provides a construct to help explain how social and ecological circumstances, like people's experiences with water, become literally incorporated biologically into physioanatomic characteristics that influence health and become expressed in societal disparities in health. First, I want to turn to Kenya to discuss an emerging water insecurity issue around the globe, which is increasing salinity content of groundwater. One of the biggest concerns for Dasanich that they expressed to us was the salinity of their water and how it can make them and their livestock sick. And in fact, one of their wells named El Chuchumvi literally means the salty riverbed. So they have a history of knowing that this is a problem in the region. We found that 93% of households are water insecure and that each 100 milligrams per liter of water salinity was associated with a greater water insecurity. Therefore, I wanted to know, how does water salinity relate to blood pressure and kidney function for dosage? Now, unlike dietary salt consumed in food, there are no guidelines for safe salinity levels in drinking water, except that sodium levels above 200 milligrams per liter are unacceptable to taste, while water with greater than 500 to 1,000 milligrams per liter is no longer classified as fresh water. Previous research in coastal Bangladesh has shown that salt content in water can lead to higher blood pressure, hypertension, preeclampsia, and kidney dysfunction. We collected water samples from all drinking and secondary water sources for households in the 7 Dawsonage communities, and we analyzed them for salinity, shown on the y-axis, separating this figure into 2 panels, first for those living near the main market town, and then those living in more remote locations. We found that nearly all water sources had salinity levels above 200 milligrams per liter. We also found that the Lake Turkana, and the standpipes had levels as high as 2,000 milligrams per liter, which people reported drinking if they didn't have any other water present. And those water sources are also used for making tea and cooking, and so they're ingesting this water in one way or another. We also found that the salinity levels were lower farther from the main market town, and they didn't have the same access to the deep, high salinity standpipes. We tested how individuals' drinking water salinity was associated with high blood pressure or hypertension, and we found that each 100 milligrams per liter of salt concentration in drinking water was associated with 45% higher odds of hypertension. And this is in spite of having low BMIs and an active lifestyle in this population, which are traditionally protective against high blood pressure. Next, we examined the odds of hyperdilute urine, which may indicate kidney damage. And similar to the blood pressure results, we found that each 100 milligrams per liter of salt in the water was associated with 33% higher odds of hyperdilute urine and an increased probability of this hyperdilute urine, which was significant in most of the models. But further biomarkers are needed to confirm this finding, which is one of the things that I'm working on right now. Shifting to the Amazon, not many people think of this region as a place of water insecurity traditionally because of the abundance of water. During my fieldwork, especially the first few years, starting in 2009, so many years ago, by talking and spending time with shamani, it became increasingly apparent to me that water access and water contamination were a major problem for people. So I wanted to understand, how does water insecurity become embodied in injury risk, as I took several tumbles down some of the banks to try to get water, and chronic stress there. Shamani often fetch water by going to the river, where the river banks can be steep, up to 50 to 60 feet in some of the study communities. And this increases the chances of falls, especially when you're carrying water, which is quite heavy, or if it's slippery. And I've definitely taken a couple of spills there. Now, water insecurity can mark the body via scars, bone breaks, and bruises from water fetching injuries. During interviews, we found that 20% of households reported a prior water fetching injury among a household member. 70% of these occurred among women. 91% of the injuries occurred from falls while retrieving or carrying water, and 9% were foot-related injuries, as many people, the majority, don't wear shoes when they're fetching water because of all the mud and there's lots of thorns. The paths people have to climb can be quite treacherous, as shown here. And one older woman told us that water-related injuries often occur after heavy rains. She said, last year during the rainy season, when it was wet, I fell and cut my elbow and bruised it badly. Not only are injuries embodied in bodily injury, but also in invisible ways. So we collected 1.5 centimeter hair samples from 332 adults, which we then had analyzed for hair cortisol concentration as a biomarker of chronic stress to approximate the last month of experience and map it on to our water insecurity scale time variable. And here we found a gendered association between water-related injury and hair cortisol concentration. Having a history of water-related injury in the household was significantly associated with 36% higher hair cortisol concentration for women, but not men. This illustrates the invisible yet gendered embodiment of chronic stress for those responsible for supplying household water for Chimani. Now, variation in where people get their drinking water was also associated with chronic stress. We found that both men and women with intermediate or unimproved water services, like getting water from open wells, had 55% and 46% higher hair cortisol concentration compared to their counterparts that used the surface water, which is the first bars. This stress is associated with access and equity issues, where they're told that their traditional water sources of the river are no longer clean, yet they see that some households and communities are receiving better water sources like taps and protected hand pumps, but they're not. And these unimproved water sources like open wells lead to frustration. Here's a man inside one of the open wells cleaning it, and he told me that it takes them 2 to 3 days sometimes to fully clean out these wells. Others complained of trash in open wells, being unable to extract water due to missing water drawing buckets, and saying that it can take longer. And others just complained that kids, as they pass by, throw trash into it. Water insecurity can become embodied in many different health outcomes, depending on the life stage. But the key takeaway from the second part is that aspects of water insecurity, like water salinity and unequal access to basic water services, may compound over a lifetime to increase risk of hypertension, kidney damage, injury, and stress. Finally, in this third part of the talk, I want to discuss how people respond to water needs and cope with water insecurity, along with their implications for health. Dietary flexibility serves as an adaptation to environmental constraints. Humans have long used behaviors and food processing techniques as culturally integrated buffers to a variety of problems. Hydration strategies are the biocultural response to meet one's water needs from available environmental and food resources. Relatedly, coping strategies are the behavioral or technological response to obtain water when facing water insecurity. Things like using multiple water sources, sharing water between households, buying bottled water, or even migrating. And these can lead to shifts in hydration strategies, which may be good or bad. The best way to buffer water insecurity is through safe delivery of water. But not all places have this access to safe water. So let's turn back to Bolivia to see how they use dietary practices to mitigate unclean water. Chimani use many water substitutes to meet their water needs aside from water. Shogdie or chicha is a traditional fermented beverage that's widely shared and delicious. They also will cut down 2 types of vines for water when they're in the old growth forest, Hueto and Cayaya. And they do this when they're thirsty and there are no other streams nearby. 1 meter of these vines contains about 8 ounces of water, and it's quite tasty. It's a little chalky, almost tastes a little carbonated. Food, or saxidie, is another major water source. Here, a family is eating a traditional Chimani meal called hona, a plantain-based stew mixed with fish or meat. The most commonly consumed foods are plantains, which are 65% water, along with a whitefish, the most commonly consumed protein source, which is 71% water. Another food source that Chimani rely on for water is fruit, and papayas are 88% water. One large papaya contains 2/3 a liter of water, which I learned one night during my first year of field work, where after dinner, I was still kind of hungry. And so I ate an entire papaya, and then I got in the mosquito net. And then about an hour later, I had to put all my clothes back on and run and pee. And then I had to do that a couple more times during the night. And I learned my lesson never to eat a papaya before bed there. There's also many other fruits that they eat, like grapefruits, oranges, limes, all with water content between 75 and 90%. Our dietary flexibility is perhaps our best defense against dehydration. What's interesting is that water intake recommendations state that food provides 20 to 30% of water in the diet. Now, unsurprisingly, these recommendations come from the US and Europe. Yet we found that Chimani get significantly more water from food sources than other populations, as half of their water came from food, which shows flexibility in hydration strategies. And this has now been validated and found in 2 other studies as well in both Japan and China. The flexibility of where people get their water also translated into a protective benefit against gastrointestinal illness. Each % increase of water intake from food was associated with 8% lower odds of gastrointestinal illness. As individuals in the sample consumed more than 40% of their water from food sources, their probability of diarrhea, shown on the y-axis, dropped significantly. So eating water may be one way to reduce exposure to too much dirty water. And here, a little infant is drinking a grapefruit. Interventions to provide clean water, like building taps, are important for gastrointestinal illnesses, but also have implications for injury risk. While we found that each point increase in water insecurity score was associated with a 28% higher odds of water-related injury, compared to households relying on surface water, households with limited or basic water access had half the odds of reporting a water-related injury. And so infrastructure can mitigate against the embodiment of water insecurity on multiple avenues. To move back to Kenya, an area without enough water, pastoralists traditionally get the majority of their calories from milk from their herds, which is also an important hydration source. However, as more of the communities have become permanent, their access to herds has dropped. So I wanted to test how milk consumption was associated with these chronic health risks of hypertension and hyperdilute urine. What we found was that in examining the relationship between groundwater salinity and hypertension, adults who consumed milk on a daily basis, the bottom line shown here, had less than half the odds of hypertension compared to adults shown on the top line who did not consume milk daily. And there was a similar association with kidney function. So when access to the herd and milk declines, people shift their hydration strategy to drink more water with salt in it, which can have negative implications for these chronic health risk factors. Finally, to shift gears to the US, not all coping or hydration strategies to mitigate water insecurity lead to positive health outcomes. The issue of whether people can trust their water is increasingly important. In the US, access to water that meets water quality standards often falls along race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic boundaries. For example, adults living in mobile home units often have less reliable access to water services, which can shift consumption of tap to bottled water. High visibility events like boil water advisories, crises, and shocks to systems can increase distrust and disuse of tap water, as we've seen recently in Flint, Michigan, and the Jackson, Mississippi water crises. And in fact, using NHANES data, looking at trends in tap water avoidance, which can serve as a proxy for water insecurity. First, we look at children, US children in this first panel, and adults in the second panel, and we can see two things. First, there are huge disparities in who avoids tap water, with Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black children and adults shown in the top two lines on both panels, avoiding tap water more than white individuals shown in the bottom line on both panels over time. And this is often due to structural inequalities, systemic racism, and growing distrust of water sources. Second, after 2013, 2014, there was a huge uptick in tap water avoidance among both children and adults. And this occurred following the Flint, Michigan water crisis, which was more pronounced in groups who identified with people affected by the crises. Overall, this translates into about 20% of the US population, or 61 million people, who do not drink their tap water. Why this matters is that when people don't drink their tap water, they're more likely to drink sugary drinks. I've shown that, in fact, those who don't drink water consume twice as many calories from sugary drinks as those that do drink water. This is bad because sugary drink consumption is associated with risk of weight gain, diabetes, and cardiometabolic disease. The key takeaways from this third part are that local beverages and foods serve as important nutritional adaptations to mitigate health risks. Second, effective water interventions can reduce risk of water-related injury, but lacking access to preferred hydration strategies or distrust of water sources can shift intake to other, sometimes less healthy options. Overall, this work contributes to our understanding of how evolutionary history affected human adaptability, demonstrating the importance of water restriction in utero in shaping water needs, as well as adaptations like urine concentration and thirst set points. Second, my research provides health implications for changes to the physical environment, as climate change predictions, including hotter temperatures and sea level rise, suggest further exacerbation of salinity problems of water in the future, and that scarcity and flooding may increase water insecurity. Finally, biocultural issues are important to understand, as dietary flexibility and hydration strategies may act as nutritional adaptations to mitigate water insecurity and affect health. So I have to thank all of my amazing collaborators, the students and the funding agencies, and of course, all of the participants, the great research teams that helped make this possible in Kenya and Bolivia. And thank you all for your attention and for putting up with my amazing jokes. And I still have not received my Grubhub drone food delivery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asher. Maybe a good thing to do is if you can unshare your screen, I'll make this sort of grid view so that we can see people at home. I guess that is, hi. And then I'll try to monitor for questions from both the at-home audience and the room. So does anyone have questions? Asher. Brian.
Hi, Asher. it was great to hear your talk and to get updated on so many amazing projects you're working on. So thanks for joining us here in Beck. One of the topics that you described across your field sites was, interrelationships between water availability and coping mechanisms. And one of those you mentioned was consumption of fermented beverages. So alcohol consumption, especially in Bolivia, where you mentioned that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the multifaceted relationships between alcohol consumption and features of water availability, even water salinity. I imagine this is something that you probably track when you're doing your interviews, because these could both independently and also interact with one another in terms of effects on kidney health. So how would you, for example, are there methods that you've developed to be able to try to like parse apart what could be, for example, a contribution of water salinity versus alcohol intake on measures of kidney function? Or are there any like independent measures that you use to kind of address that issue?
Thanks. It's a really interesting question. So I've definitely thought about alcohol first, why it's so important to, many of the different variables, right? So in terms of hydration, one of the really fascinating things about humans is that there have been a series of experiments to look at how humans digest and we're able to use alcohol in terms of maintaining body water homeostasis. And the short of it is that depending on a person's hydration status and the percent of alcohol volume or percent ethanol of the beverage, it has differential effects on hydration. So everybody thinks that alcohol is net dehydrating because it creates diuresis, so you pee out a lot of the water, right? But if a person is dehydrated and they consume low percent ethanol volume, 1%, 2%, about 3%, 4% is like the limit where we start to see changes in this. But if you consume low percent ethanol, and you're dehydrated, then that can actually be net hydrating. Whereas if a person is well hydrated and they consume the low percent alcohol beverage, like a beer, then that will create diuresis. So in terms of like human evolution and adaptation to water scarcity, we can think about these cultural mechanisms of fermentation as a way to potentially deal with, dehydration. But now, in populations that live with a lot of water access, we might not be walking around in a state of dehydration. And so we might not see that same benefit. Now, in relation to how alcohol interacts with salinity, that's a really interesting question, because we know that ethanol can affect the kidney in certain damaging ways, but also salt can help retain or it can help add to body water homeostasis as it attracts water to it. In terms of like how I've looked at this in the models and in interviews, we ask about all the different types of alcohol that's consumed in the different populations. So in Bolivia, we ask about traditional methods or traditional alcohol like chicha, but we also ask about more market alcohols like beers. And then there's grain alcohol, which is increasing in prevalence and it can get quite nasty. And then we also do the same thing in Kenya, because they will create their own home brews as well. And there's more Ethiopian alcohols that are coming in, like gins that are homemade. And again, those have differential effects on risk of dehydration. So we put those in as covariates when we're looking at if our main outcome variable is, say, like hydration status, to try to understand that, or if we're looking at kidney function and we're trying to use those as control variables rather than as like primary explanatory variables. But the interaction between the salinity of the water and alcohol is not something that I've thought about a ton and would be interesting to explore further.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Let's take a question from Molly next on Zoom.
That was fascinating. discussion there. Thank you for such a great talk, Asher. Great to see you virtually. I was just wondering, you very briefly mentioned the microbiome, and I was just wondering if you had any more to expand on the relationship between hydration and microbial composition, whether there's anything we should be thinking about in terms of hydration levels across human evolutionary history and how they might relate to microbial composition across human evolutionary history. I'm embarrassed to say I'd never thought of this as one of the factors never thought of water, availability and hydration levels as one of the factors that, of course, causes different environments to exist within the body to then, attract and grow different microorganisms.
Thanks. It's great to see you too, Molly. One of the interesting things about the gut microbiome research, which I'm not an expert in microbiome research, but I am aware of a few of the papers that have been done just because I kind of am interested in the whole suite of factors associated with water insecurity. And we can look at it in a few different ways in terms of associations with the gut microbiome and microbial composition and diversity. There was one study done in Nicaragua by Barbara Piperata out of Ohio State and some of her colleagues, and they looked at the gut microbial diversity in terms of cleanliness of water access. So they looked at different households, and they looked at which households had water stored in their house that had higher levels of E. coli concentration. So what they found was that kids living in households that had more polluted water, more contaminated with E. coli water, had, I believe, less microbial diversity than households that had cleaner water. In the United States, a new study came out in the last year or so, and what they were looking at, this was a larger study, they looked at different sources. So they looked at the gut microbiome diversity in people who got water from their municipal sources versus people that got it from well sources versus bottled water. And what they found was that people that got water from wells, which are not regulated and not treated in the same way that, say, municipal water sources are, had more diversity in them. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but the one other little point I will make about the gut microbiome, which I think is really interesting and is something that we definitely need to explore further, especially in relation to increasing salinity, is that when you look at other animals like fish or whatever, Rob Knight and I were on a panel a few months ago, and I was asking him this because he's like the microbiome person. I was like, what about water? And he said, that, yeah, it is significant. It comes up in models, but the effect isn't as strong as, say, like food and some of those other sources. But when you look at like salinity gradients in fish, you can start to see differences in microbial diversity or gut, whatever microbiome diversity based on salinity gradients. So maybe if people are drinking water that's more saline, that may affect it too, but I haven't seen any data on that yet.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions in the room? Oh, okay, yeah, go for it. And then Dan.
Thank you. This was a really great presentation. It was fascinating for me because I work on a project in Mexico that is studying water scarcity in households in Mexico City and now more broadly in the National Health and Nutrition Survey. So this was fascinating. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how, I know you used HYs in Bolivia and in Kenya. I was wondering if you used HYs in the United States, where piped water is more of the standard. I'm wondering how insecurity is reported and how the HY scale works in places where water is piped to a majority of the population, but where that white water might not be trustable. Or drinkable. So I'm wondering about your reflections on the ability to use HYs in places where water is, provided in more consistently, I guess. Or
okay, great. Yeah, maybe people in the room could introduce themselves just because I don't know who you're. And on Zoom, I can see people's names, but
Yeah,
what was your name?
I'm Faith. I'm a first year PhD student in psych med anthropology here. I work in Mexico. We're working on a team with sociocultural anthropologists, engineers, biological anthropologists, and epidemiologists.
Out of Michigan State?
Out of University of Michigan.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
I'm familiar with the project. Great. Yeah. So it's a good question because, you know, HWISE and now IWISE, the individual water insecurity experiences scale, it was first validated and developed. We developed it in low and middle income countries. So I was one of the site PIs for using that in lowland Bolivia. So Sarah Young, who's one of my key collaborators, she's already implemented it in a nationally representative survey in the United States. And it's not yet deployed, and HWISE isn't deployed yet in any nationally representative samples. We're hoping to deploy it soon. We're actually collaborating with members of the CDC right now to try to implement it into a nationally representative survey this summer, or a scale that we're kind of working on together with them because they're really interested in this question. So I think if you're really interested in, you know, questions of this scale of, you know, household water insecurity experiences, we really need to think about the different dimensions that it measures and how those might vary across pockets of the population. The data that I showed from NHANES, which, so I published a paper in the Journal of Nutrition showing how we can use a couple of different proxy variables from dietary recall as valid proxies for water insecurity in the United States when we don't have a validated experiential scale yet. And what we see there is kind of trying to show the broader picture of tap water avoidance, because that's really trying to get at the use dimension of water insecurity, which is dependent on both acceptability and availability. So if the water isn't acceptable or available, then it's not going to be used. And so if you can at least measure the use dimension of water insecurity, then you can also measure there's other dimensions to you. My gut in terms of thinking about, you know, just the water insecurity scale, it really depends which pocket of the population you're going to be working with. In areas where there's more issues with water quality violations, where piped water is not as readily available, like in the colonias, or if you're dealing with low-income settings as well and Native American reservations, then those water insecurity scales are going to be gonna show up a bit more. Like you're gonna see more people affirming those questions. But in the majority of places in the United States where the water is clean and people drink it, then it's likely not to show up as being affirmed very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's take a question from Dan on Zoom.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting and incredibly broad talk. So I have a couple of kind of comments, questions. I don't really know what they are. In no particular order, maybe working backwards chronologically in your talk is a simple way. So you mentioned tap water avoidance and the consequences with regard to, you know, diabetes and things like that due to sugary drink consumption. It strikes me that this is kind of a double whammy when it comes to oral health, because most municipalities fluoridate their water. So tap water avoidant households, the kids are getting the double shot of, you know, increased sugar intake and decreased fluoride exposure. And I wonder whether, you know, you have such a broad network of collaborators. I wonder whether you're working with anybody on that. Another question, again, just really stimulating talk, so all these ideas pop into my head, right? Which is thinking about your work on milk consumption in pastoralists, since many African pastoralists also consume blood, and blood has much higher saline content than milk does. I'm curious whether you've explored the implications of that as a food source on hydration status and kidney function. And then lastly, and here I must preface this remark with an apology to my colleagues, because they heard me harp on the same point very recently, and it sounds very self-promoting and you know, read my paper kind of stuff, and that's not what this is about. Which is, I'm just fascinated and curious, and you know, it seems very relevant to your work and your expertise. And you mentioned prenatal and early life dehydration. And basically, I wrote an armchair paper several decades ago where I argued that increased lifelong salt preferences as a consequence of early dehydration reflected an adaptive response due to water retention in those environments. And I'm curious whether, since you're asking people about their subjective preferences for water intake, I wonder whether you've considered measuring salt intake and what you make of that idea more broadly.
Yeah, thank you. Can you send me that paper?
Sure.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah. So 3 stimulating questions to go with the 3 parts of the talk. I love it. Okay, so I'll answer them in order. In terms of the tap water avoidance and the double whammy on kids, yeah, we have, I have collaborated with a dentist out of East Carolina University in which we were looking at sugar sweetened beverage intake, and we did measure like tap water avoidance as like a control variable, but the key question was, how is sugary drink intake associated with risk of cavities in kids and adults when you adjust for tap water avoidance? And we did find, this kind of double whammy, as you call it. And we adjusted for fluoride levels because NHANES does measure blood fluoride levels, or at least in a few of the survey waves. So that was awesome. They also get water samples, or at least in a few waves they do, and they've looked at the fluoride levels in the household. But you're right. And this is one of the things that I've been trying to make a point here in State College. They're taking the fluoride out of the water. And I was just so upset by that. There was, I don't want to get into the whole like things and everything that they were bringing up, but you're right. And it's particularly low income and racially minoritized kids that end up suffering. We see the larger oral health disparity gaps when fluoride is taken out of the water, or because of living in areas where there is higher distrust of tap water. And so they don't get the same fluoride, and then they get more sugar, which, affects risk of cavities and dental caries. Second, in terms of the blood salinity, we ask when we measure diet, but I have not assessed the amount because it's such an episodically consumed food, especially right now with Dosanich. So it's hard for that type of signature to pop up and be able to, with a broad enough sample, be able to test like this person consumed 100 milliliters of blood in the last 24 hours. How does that associate with their daily hydration status when we get their urine sample? That type of question would be fascinating, especially in an experiment. So it's definitely something that we could try to look at by using purposive sampling when they slaughter, a goat or a cattle, and then, as they're eating the meat and also drinking the blood, we would need to, be like, okay, we're going to measure how much everybody's consuming, and give us your pee. And then we would be able to kind of assess how that affects their hydration levels. And in terms of the kidney function biomarkers, a lot of times these kidney function biomarkers, and one of the things that I'm more interested in is trying to understand whether some of these effects are, whether they happen and then they go away, or if they're persistent. So if a person is consuming high saline water for just a few weeks, that may show up in kidney injury molecule biomarker, or if then they go away from that, maybe their kidney function gets better over time. So depending on the dose and how long the dose lasts. So, blood and the salinity concentration of that would be an interesting variable to throw in there. And then finally, in terms of the lifelong salt preferences, in terms of the prenatal and early life exposures to salt consumption, I think that mechanism makes a lot of sense to me. In terms of these early life environment studies, there hasn't been a ton of them, especially, there have been some really good animal model studies that I referenced a couple of them in terms of the maternal water restriction and how that then leads to variation in plasma osmolality of the offspring. And so if we were then able to then follow that offspring later into life and then measure their salt preferences, that would be a really interesting thing to do. When we ask about people's perception of thirst, that could also be another variable of like, how nice would it be to eat something that's slightly salty right now, to try to get at a salt preference as well. We do ask about like how much salt have you consumed or used in the last week or so, to try to get at the dietary component of salt intake away from just the water salt intake. But I don't have any data on that, but I think it's a really interesting hypothesis.
Well, it sounds like, I mean, if you're already collecting data on salt consumption over the last week, and season of birth and corresponding, water availability at the time, then at least even with your existing data, you could conceivably see whether the correlation replicates in that population that's been documented elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
So really fascinating. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks. So let me ask if there's any questions in the room. Ashley.
Can you hear me from back here?
Yes.
Cool. All right.
Introduce yourself.
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm a second year graduate student, and my specialty or subfield is biological anthropology. I'm interested in developmental programming of the stress response. So when you spoke about in utero exposures affecting like the developmental programming of homeostatic set points regarding thirst perception, I was wondering if you had any speculation as to like the underlying mechanism. And then the second part of the question was, you spoke about in utero effects. I'm also wondering if you had any thoughts or had looked at any other sensitive periods that might be relevant.
Thanks. Those are two great questions. In terms of some of the underlying mechanisms that we can think of in terms of fetal or developmental programming with thirst perception and brain thirst set points, I think one of the common mechanisms that we frequently point to is increased cortisol concentration. And that, it's a stressor. And if it's associated with, water restriction and severe dehydration of in the pregnant mother, then that stress can be transmitted to the fetus. So similar to food stress. But then it could also potentially affect the placenta, the amniotic fluid and the volume of that potentially. So you could think about ways to test that. I haven't seen any actual data on that. I was part of a randomized control trial that we did here, the Healthy Mom Zone study, and they tracked women from 7 weeks of gestation all the way through giving birth. And this was a randomized control trial to look at how different interventions related behavioral, hydration, affected healthy gestational weight gain. And what they found between the intervention group and the control group was that, when you encourage healthy hydration, women have more dilute urine, they're less dehydrated. So it's actually a really simple, easy intervention. But they also collected amniotic volume at I think 6 time points throughout the pregnancy. And one of the ideas after we published our one main hydration paper was that, well, first, we also saw the signals of body size. So in terms of we see cortisol potentially affecting the offspring. And what that then does and can do is lead to smaller body size, smaller birth weight, birth length. We see that in the animal models. And we saw that at least preliminarily in this RCT, but it was a small sample size. So I would, advise caution in interpreting that. And why the small body size is important is because when you look at human water needs, body size is one of the biggest components to water needs. And a smaller body size basically preps an individual to have lower water needs overall. So those are, some potential responses. In terms of other sensitive periods that we might think of for hydration and water thirst beyond just in utero, I think probably a similar critical period, around 2 to 4 years of age would be important to understand, especially because we know that when kids around the age of 2, if they have a lot of bouts of diarrhea, that results in lifelong lower height attainment. So potentially there could be something there as well. And then I'll just add one last thing. And then one of the other things that we've kind of looked at is dysregulation of body water homeostasis by weight status later in life. And so we've published one paper, and then I've seen some other studies that have kind of also shown this, that adults with obesity have a slightly affected body water homeostatic response. So they consume more water than adults with normal weight, but they're relatively more dehydrated even at greater water intake levels. And that may have to do with thermoregulation and responses to heat as well.
Interesting. Thank you. I would say just mention for the people who are on Zoom, because I see there's quite a few people on there, but we can only see about 4 or 5 people from the room. If you want to ask a question, please do use the raise hand option, and then you'll pop up to the top of the screen so we can see you. Does anyone here have additional questions? I guess I have a question that came to mind. Is it true, or is it the case that some people who do have access to water, good access to water, maybe wealthy people, are tap water avoidant? And what are the consequences of that for, I guess I can think of like health consequences. I know in LA, a lot of people won't drink the water. They somehow think it's bad. Maybe it is, I don't know. What are the health consequences for that? And then are there other kinds of knock-on consequences? Because I wonder about, now we're just so worried about plastics and the environment and things like that. And it seems like there's a lot of people who are preferring to drink bottled water, who could drink tap water if they wanted to, but they have some reason for drinking the bottled water. Do you have any thoughts on that, or know any research on that?
Yeah, sure. So it's an interesting question, because when we think about the different ways we can conceptualize tap water avoidance, one of them is, not drinking any tap water. Some people may treat their water via reverse osmosis to really, get all of anything in it out. Other people buy bottled water. Some people, because they don't want to, if they're spending money, they might, buy something that tastes better than water. Like juice, for example, kombucha. I don't know. What are you all drinking a lot? Anyways, yeah. And so we do see variation because, for example, my in-laws, they live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and they're they're retired, and there was a plant that was releasing forever chemicals, PFAS and PFOAs, into the water. And so nobody was drinking the water, but it wasn't a situation where people are necessarily doing it because they are in a marginalized community, but rather because of environmental contaminants. And then they've since tried to remunerate that and deal with it, but there is a lingering distrust that then occurs. And so people can be exposed to these types of shocks, national headlines and media about water crises, and that there's lead in water, that there's lead leaching out of pipes into the drinking water. And that does lead to tap water avoidance. So what ends up happening in some of those situations can be, shifting to other strategies. But when we think about bottled water, it's even more complicated, because with bottled water, it's not necessarily only tap water avoidance. It can be a status symbol. It can be convenience. You can be on the go. So there's a lot of other variables that go into effect there. But then there's also an environmental component of single-use plastics, and drinking water from single-use plastics and people will sometimes reuse that plastic, and then the plastic leaches out of that single-use plastic water bottle. So there's a lot of different, implications to all of those situations.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Anyone in our Zoom audience have additional questions?
I see that Erica said that in LA, you drink fancy water with undetectable healthy additives.
You were just like, what do you drink in LA?
Yeah.
There's just a lot of like, oh,
Like smart water, things like
nitro
that.
injected magic water. Anyway.
Right.
Yeah, the worst you can do is drink raw water, which was like the worst trend. And I was just like, oh my gosh. Like, yeah, we drink raw water sometimes in Bolivia, and you get parasites. Like that is what happens.
Yeah. Interesting. I see Dan has another question.
I'm happy to wait if there are others. I'm fascinated by Asher's expertise, and if no one else has a question, I'll go.
Go for it, Dan.
I was just curious, you mentioned fermentation in terms of sort of traditional ways of increasing, the safety of water to be consumed. And I'm curious whether, and I recognize this might be, outside of your own area of investigation, but perhaps of work, whether, there are, first of all, whether there have been studies of convergent cultural evolution in the invention of fermentation for this purpose, right? And whether that correlates with, for example, pathogen prevalence. And secondly, whether there are other technologies that cultural evolution has arrived at, filtration processes or things like that. I mean, so cultural evolution is remarkably, innovative and productive in solving these kinds of problems. And this is a problem that we would expect to be recurrent across a variety of ecologies.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not an expert in fermentation. I do enjoy the process. And I will say that one of the early works that I found that really fascinated me and really kind of spurred some of my early thinking about how eating our food, eating our water from food, so getting a lot of your water from fruits or beverage or foods and water-rich foods, like what does that do to exposure to pathogens? And the literature that I found was basically looking at cider producers, and they were talking about how apples are these clean water containers, and how if they, cider fermentation is this great way to clean water. And I was like, oh yes, of course, and so are fruit. So there is that work that's looked at, cider, and there in terms of convergent cultural evolution with fermentation. There's one paper that was published in PNAS by, I think, Matthew Kerrigan, that looked at the genetic adaptation to be able to consume ethanol. And he looked at this in different taxa and found that there was around 50 million years ago a genetic adaptation to be able to process ethanol. And so that, it's a really fascinating, his theory, I think, was, animals started fruit would fall down from trees and it would ferment. And who hasn't seen a video of a squirrel eating a fermented crab apple and then going wild, right? And so, of course, that's so much fun that, and it provided extra calories and whatnot that potentially allowed for that evolution that we still have that adaptation to be able to consume fermentation and be able to use it. In terms of how that relates to pathogen exposure, I'm not necessarily sure, but I think that in situations where there isn't access to clean water, that can be a cultural strategy. And it's probably one of the reasons why we see alcohol be independently created in so many places around the world thousands and thousands of years ago, with wine, small beers in the Middle Ages, and as these culturally mediated receptacles of clean water.
Fascinating. Thank you.
We have time for another question, if anyone has one. Either at home or here. I noticed, I listened to an interview with, there's this water now called Liquid Death. If you've seen this. And I don't know if it's true, but the guy who invented this water or whatever, he was being interviewed on NPR, and he claims that it actually makes kids drink more water because, or at least that he had heard from some parents that there's a resistance to kids just drinking a bottle of water, and there's this can that says Liquid Death with a skull on it, and that the kids would actually drink it more because it was cool. No idea if that's true, but this guy's whole business model was making water cool, even though it's ironic. I mean, I don't know what the reason to name it that is, other than it gets people to look at the can, but there's nothing in it but drinking water. As far as I know, there's no special about it. But.
Yeah, I gave a talk to the Penn State Water Organization, and they took me to a little happy hour right afterwards. And one of the guys got that. He got the Liquid Death, and that one was sparkling water, so at least it had that. And I was like, why are you paying for this and everything? Yeah, so maybe it works, but again, that's very anecdotal.
Right.
So
well, this was also an interview with the CEO, so he's just in hog heaven being able to say his business model to NPR. But I guess it is a very very well-selling brand of water. And he also said for adults, maybe this is what was going on that you observed, that it also is a way for people to drink something who don't want to drink alcohol, and they end up just drinking water, but it's kind of cooler than having a Perrier or something. No idea. But it is interesting to think about strategies to get people to drink water that might not otherwise do it, including maybe kids. I don't know if it's hard to get kids to drink water, but it seems maybe it might be. If they can drink juice instead, maybe they don't want to have a glass of water. I don't know.
For sure.
Anyhow, and if there's no more comments or questions, we can thank Asher for a great talk. Thank you so much for zooming in.
And I'm still waiting. So Clark, you just update me on the drone delivery.
Okay, yeah,
Hub. And
I'll drop a pin. I think it's over North Dakota right now. So
okay.
Keep an eye out. Like I said, it's sushi, so it should be good when it gets there, probably Wednesday.
I mean, it depends on the elevation.
That's true.
Of the drone.
That's true. All right. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Asher.
Bye. Have
Bye.
a good one.